This presentation was originally given at the 2024 B.O.T.A conference in Loveland, Colorado. Dear fellow aspirants, thank you all for being here today, for gathering together to collectively deepen our conscious realization of our fundamental unity, to know and feel in ever greater measure that we are all beautiful and precious expressions of the one life power. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we will journey back into our past in search of illumination. Hopefully, we may find some light to brighten our paths here and now, and to help us be of greater service to others in the future. Disclaimer. We are also about to go over a fair number of dates, names, locations, and events, for which I apologize in advance. But please don't worry. There are no expectations that you will remember any of these details, and there will not be a quiz at the end. I promise. The words of our theme, From the Heart, speak to me of something that arises from love, something that comes through without agenda or intellectual second-guessing, and is given without any expectation for compensation or acquisition. It is pure and unimpeded, fresh and bright, like crystal waters from a mountain spring, or the sun that shines on all, giving of itself freely, without judgment or conditions. There are many, many examples of such consciousness in our order's history, but one person stands out to me as a living embodiment of this way of being. Her name was Harriet Bullock Case. To many of us, we may already know of her as Mrs. Paul Foster Case. What we may not know is how much she gave of herself to our order and this work, quietly and humbly from behind the scenes. Harriet was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, on March 29, 1893. Her birth name was Harriet Eckstein Bullock, reflecting both her parents' family names, Eckstein from her mother Janet, and Bullock from her father George. In many respects, Harriet was extremely fortunate. She was born into a life of ease, privilege, and luxury, as both her parents came from unusually wealthy and influential families. This is also quite fortunate from a historian's perspective, as they often appeared in the society pages of newspapers. In 1902, one of those early newspaper appearances relayed how the family was staying at the Royal Palm Resort in Miami, Florida, on their way back from wintering in Nassau, Bahamas. Ah, the life. Winters in the Bahamas were something that Paul Foster Case also experienced as a child. The Dickinson family, who owned the home and library where his family lived, also owned a home in Nassau on Bay Street. Together, the Case and Dickinson families would sojourn to the island each year to escape the bitterly cold New York winters. Unlike Paul, Harriet was an only child, but she and her parents often participated in events together, so she seemed to have no lack of loving and supportive companionship. As for people her own age, the newspapers are full of reports of extravagant balls, dances, parties, and other society gatherings that she attended. She also received quality instruction from a French governess. As a result, Harriet spoke French fluently, which proved to be very helpful in multiple phases of her life. Later, she attended a private finishing school, and according to Reverend Eugene Amard, Harriet was also educated abroad in both France and Switzerland. Additionally, Harriet frequently took part in numerous local clubs and social functions. In 1903, a newspaper article listed Harriet as a member of the Butterfly Club, an association of little girls, which hosted an event to benefit the Fresh Air Society, a charity that sought to provide camping and outdoor experiences for children of families who couldn't afford such activities on their own. At the tender age of 10, this small act heralded what would be a lifelong devotion to serving others. Harriet also loved horses. She seemed to have inherited this passion from her parents. All three of them had horses of their own, which were often ribbon winners in local shows. Harriet's horse, Felice, received multiple accolades in 1904 when Harriet was just a few days shy of her 11th birthday. On Sunday, July 10, 1904, the Cincinnati Enquirer stated, Mr. and Mrs. George Bullock of Vernonville, who likewise are prominent members of the Riding Club of Cincinnati, rode horseback almost daily until their departure for Oyster Bay. Their daughter, Miss Harriet Bullock, accompanied her parents on her Kentucky pony and bids fair to become a skilled horsewoman. The note about Oyster Bay referred to the fact that George, Janet, and Harriet had moved to a new home on Long Island, New York, sometime in the 1890s, and were traveling back and forth to Ohio for vacations and family visits. The estate on Long Island, which was humorously called the Folly, was seated on the very tip of Center Island, on the northern coast of the main island. Among its many features were, of course, stables, where Harriet had at least two horses, Lady Babby and Lady Betty, both prize winners. The move to Long Island was probably due to George's work. He was an electrical engineer in the dawning days of the electrification of the country. But he was also the president of the National Oil Burner Company and the chairman of the board of the Erie Railways Company. Later in life, George served as the mayor for the Center Island community. When Harriet turned 18 in 1911, her involvement with the New York society scene skyrocketed. From then on, she was present at the most stylish galas the big city had to offer. She made her formal debut on December 11th during a reception given by her mother at the family townhome in Manhattan. But in addition to all the ritz, Harriet continued to keep her mind on the needs of others. For example, earlier that year she helped facilitate a Valentine's Day fete to benefit the New York Association for the Blind. The fete was created in response to a request from Helen Keller, one of the association's vice presidents. Harriet performed in the evening's entertainment, in which she danced with Baroness von Rothenthal in her first U.S. appearance. Characters in the dance were meant to personify people from antiquity from all around the world, Europe, Africa, Asia, and America. Harriet's role was that of Cleopatra, representing Africa with the assistance of 7 others. Attendees included U.S. President William Howard Taft, the First Lady, the Governor of New York State, the Mayor of New York City, a Supreme Court Justice, the U.S. Secretaries of State and the Treasury, and the ambassadors of Great Britain, Germany, France, and Japan. On an unexpected note of connection, the Valentine's Day fete was held at the Hotel Astor, which 11 years later would be the very site where the first B.O.T.A lectures were given by Paul Foster Case. 2 months after the Valentine fete, in April, Harriet sang in a chorus to help raise money for a day nursery. In case you're curious, she was an alto. It was around this time that Harriet displayed her inclination to gently, but determinedly, defy imprisoning and outworn societal conventions. In an article from October 31st, 1911, the reporter described a growing trend for female horse riders to wear trousers, an article of clothing strictly limited to men in that era. The article read, Miss Harriet Bullock is another girl who always rides in trousers. When she shows off her Lady Betty, a handsome mare, She wears the long-skirted coat and tidy breeches beneath, with English puttees. In 1912, Harriet served as the secretary for the Downing House, a facility managed by the YWCA as a summer boarding place for young businesswomen. It's unclear if this was her first secretarial position, but it certainly wasn't her last. But the big, big news of 1912 was that Harriet was getting married. The announcement was made on July 11th, and the wedding took place at 12:30 p.m. on October 15th at the Folly on Center Island. Harriet wore white satin with lace trim and a veil. A circlet of orange blossoms crowned her head, and her bouquet was made from lilies of the valley. The lucky groom was named Crawford Burton. Crawford was a Harvard graduate and a stock market investor. He was highly athletic and intensely competitive. Harriet was 19 years of age at the time of the wedding, and Crawford was 26. It's not entirely clear what Harriet and Crawford had in connection. Perhaps it was the interest in sport. Harriet had her horses, but she was also an avid sailor, having won several races at the Siwanhaka Corinthian Yacht Club. As for Crawford, his great love was amateur steeplechase horse racing. In later years, he won some of the most prestigious races and was considered the greatest amateur jockey of his day. The newlyweds moved into an apartment in Manhattan, not far from the Bullock townhome. Speaking of homes, Harriet's parents sold the Folly the following year in 1913 and built a stunning new mansion named Yedden after a town in Yorkshire, England, where the Bullock family can be traced. The estate spanned 27 acres and included the main residence, a boathouse, water gardens, a reflecting pool, a beach cottage, rose gardens, garages, and other structures. The house itself had 27 rooms and was staffed with many servants. But before we begin to think this was excessively lavish, let's not forget that this was just the Bullock Country Summer Home. There were two more homes in Manhattan, one on 57th Street and another on Park Avenue. And there was the bungalow vacation home at Nassau in the Bahamas. Harriet and Crawford had two children together. David Crawford Burton, born on March 10, 1914, and Sheila Crawford Burton, born 6 years later on February 25, 1920. In the letters of Paul Foster Case and other documents, there are several references to Harriet living in Paris for a while. There are also accounts of her studying under the famous Ukrainian sculptor Alexander Archipenko. This is likely to have occurred sometime between 1912 and 1914, when Archipenko had his own art school in Paris. Harriet absolutely loved her artistic studies, and according to a brief biography of her in a 1963 issue of Adytum News Notes, Archipenko considered her one of his most talented students. But then disaster struck, and the world was turned upside down with the outbreak of World War I on July 28, 1914. Germany declared war on France just 6 days later, causing many people to flee Paris, including Archipenko. Newspaper reports from 1915 and 1917 show that Harriet must have also left Paris and returned to the U.S. But, without any doubt, she would find herself back in France again before the war was over. When the dire need for assistance became evident, Harriet devoted herself to the Duryea War Relief, which provided humanitarian aid, including medicine, medical treatment, clothing, food, and other necessities to over 70,000 war survivors and refugees in France. At the beginning of 1918, the French government decorated Harriet for her efforts with the war relief. The announcement states that she was one of the first women from the U.S. to volunteer overseas. A letter from Mrs. Duryea herself, dated November 28, 1918, describes how she and Harriet had just returned from the battlefields, where they had witnessed intense horrors and immense suffering. A part of the letter reads, "Dead horses and German corpses still lay in the fields, from which I turned shuddering eyes." On a related note, Paul Case's younger brother, Warren Foster Case, was studying music in Vienna, Austria, under the renowned Polish pianist Theodore Leschetizky before the war erupted. Then, as a soldier in the 307th Infantry of the U.S. Army, he fought on the front lines in France from April 1918 to April 1919. Let's take a moment to pause here and imagine what it must have been like for Harriet to experience this aspect of humanity, which was so alien to her previous life experience. What emotions and thoughts must have torn through her. War scars us all, no matter how near or far we may be from the violence. But to walk into the fire willingly for others, that requires a degree of bravery and compassion that most of us never realize we have deep inside, waiting for us to find it. Such valiant hearts are either burned or tempered, or maybe a bit of both, but they are never the same again. When the war finally came to an end, Harriet returned to the U.S. and attempted to re-enter her previous life of social pursuits. However, these activities no longer held interest or meaning for her like they did before. Instead, there was now a deep and burning desire to know more about the spiritual nature of humanity and to be of service to the world. Harriet began to explore wisdom teachings from around the globe, East and West, past and present. Along the way, she discovered Alice Bailey, her teachings, and her organization, the Arcane School, which was founded in New York in 1923. According to B.O.T.A. oral legend, Harriet served as the secretary for this organization for a while, although I have not yet found anything concrete to support this or know when it may have taken place. It's also possible that Harriet's parents may have introduced her to some forms of alternative spirituality at an early age. When her father died in 1932, the memorial service was conducted by a minister from Christian Science, an organization that flowed out of the same current as New Thought. Perhaps at least partly due to her shift in consciousness, after 21 years of marriage, Harriet divorced Crawford Burton in Reno, Nevada on March 12, 1934. Her son David was 20 at the time and her daughter Sheila was 14. It didn't take long for Harriet and Crawford to find new spouses, however. Crawford remarried just 3 days after the divorce, and Harriet had a new husband 2 weeks after Crawford. This time, she wed Captain Louis George Paget. Louis was British and came from a long line of military officers. Although born in London, the Weems family on his mother's side came from Fife, Scotland, where they owned a sizable castle. Louis's uncle, Lord Wester Weems, was Admiral of the Fleet and First Sea Lord, the highest-ranking officer of the Royal Navy. Lord Weems was also the senior negotiator of the ceasefire at the end of World War I, selecting the time of 11 p.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month for its poetic nature and because it was earlier than the time desired by the Prime Minister, thus saving more lives. Louis served in the Royal Air Force during the war, but left in 1926 and became one of Britain's top test pilots for experimental aircraft, a sort of English Chuck Yeager. Then, in 1931, his Widgeon parasol monoplane crashed, and he sustained injuries to his leg, causing him to retire. At the time of the wedding, Harriet was 41 years old and the groom was 43. They were married at All Souls Unitarian Church in Manhattan at 4 p.m. on March 29, 1934. Although it was a quiet ceremony with only a couple of guests, the press was there to capture this marriage of importance. In the wedding announcement in the papers, Harriet was described as a well-known sculptress. The couple honeymooned at the Bullock home in Nassau for a month and then took up residence in New York. However, throughout their marriage, they spent quite a bit of time in England and elsewhere. Together, they traveled and saw the world. Around 1937, Alice Bailey initiated what was called the Triangle Program, which involved multiple groups of 3 people working together meditatively for the use and benefit of the spiritual hierarchy. It said that Harriet was one of the original participants in this practice. In 1938, Harriet's daughter Sheila also married a British military man. That same year, the 2 couples spent the winter together in India. Sheila then moved to England in 1939. Speaking of her children, when World War II began, Harriet's son David followed in her footsteps by traveling to France and volunteering to drive ambulances. This was in mid-1940, long before the U.S. entered the fighting. At this same time, Sheila worked in a stretcher party in Lambeth, London, during the heaviest part of the Blitz. By 1941, David had entered the military and held the rank of lieutenant. He married an American woman in 1942. Back in 1938 or thereabouts, Harriet and Lewis moved out to the countryside, to Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire. The picturesque little town had a bustling population of just over 800 souls. It was here that Lewis died on September 11, 1943, at the age of 52. The cause of death is not listed in the official documentation, but whatever the cause, it must have been devastating for Harriet. Now, at last, we finally arrive at the doorsteps of Builders of the Adytum. Somewhere along the way, in her pursuit of greater light and wisdom, Harriet learned of the existence of Paul Foster Case and B.O.T.A. Just look at that smile. Stories of exactly how Paul and Harriet met vary wildly, to say the very least. One story claims that Paul, being physically depleted, was invited to vacation in Jamaica with his friends Hubert and Viola O'Malley. Hubert was a leading psychic in the Boston area. Hubert and Viola, known affectionately as Kitty, were also friends of Harriet's. After recuperating on the island, Hubert arranged for Paul and Harriet to meet in Boston. Supposedly this happened in 1944 or 1945. Some of this is definitely true and provably so, thanks to some letters. There was indeed a shared friendship between Harriet, Paul, Hubert, and Kitty, and Paul did go to Jamaica with the O'Malleys. However, Harriet was already a B.O.T.A. member and corresponding with Paul way back in 1941, and without any romantic aspects to their interactions. She was happily married to Lewis at the time, and her relationship with Paul was simply that of student and teacher. Still, it's quite possible that Hubert and Kitty told Harriet about Paul's work in 1941 or earlier, and then arranged for the 2 to meet in person in 1944 or 1945. It's also conceivable that Harriet initially learned about Paul through Alice Bailey, as the 2 of them had been friends since the 1920s. Alice, or Alice Ann as Paul sometimes called her, had even lectured at the B.O.T.A headquarters in Boston in the early 1930s during the School of Ageless Wisdom phase. In any case, Harriet became a B.O.T.A member no later than June 1941. This was when the membership was quite small, and Paul used to write a personal letter to each student on a monthly basis. In a letter dated July 2, 1941, and addressed to Mrs. Lewis Paget, Paul wrote, "Dear Sister in LVX, thank you for your letter of June 20th and its enclosure. Your contribution will help definitely to spread our work. It will go for postage, one of our biggest items of expense." So, right from the beginning, we can see that Harriet was contributing to the well-being of the order. The letter went on to discuss Alice Bailey's arcane school in a way that suggests that Harriet was still involved in that organization, or had been so in recent times. In another letter from August 15, 1941, Paul carried on what must have been an earlier conversation about Nassau in the Bahamas. He wrote, "The house used to be called Melrose when I lived on Bay Street. Did they ever do anything to the old Burnside place? Somewhere I have a picture of a tamarind tree on that place, blown over in a gale, but going right on growing and bearing. The year I went to Jamaica to visit Hubert's people, I thought of going to Nassau, but I've about made up my mind to keep it in memory and not spoil the picture by seeing it as it is now. But I would like to be there in Sapodilla time." Then, in another letter dated November 12, 1941, Paul penned, "Dear Mrs. Paget, to tell you what hasn't happened to me during the last 3 months would take less space than to recite the tale of woe." This passage almost certainly relates to the departure of Paul's wife, Dorothy Spring, along with her children, grandchildren, and supportive income. The divorce left him emotionally destroyed and financially destitute, ushering in one of the most challenging periods of his life. The letter continues. "One of the amusing things about your letter is that you should be turning to me through tarot in the expectation of unfolding your emotional side. For some reason or other, PFC has quite a reputation for being so mental that nobody can get near him. Kitty will tell you the reputation's undeserved, but there's something about my phiz and my way of speaking and writing which appears to make people credit me with being pretty much of an iceberg, as aloof as the hermit and tarot." On another but very significant note, Paul Foster Case and Ann Davies had their momentous meeting on the evening of July 27, 1944. Shortly thereafter, Anne and her young daughter Bonnie moved into the 6018 Springvale Drive home and B.O.T.A headquarters with Paul. Anne was then able to help Paul rebuild his strength and take a great deal of the logistical concerns off his shoulders. Eventually, 2 years later, 5 years after Paul's divorce and 3 years after Lewis's death, Paul and Harriet were married on August 29, 1946, by a justice of the peace in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, where Harriet lived. Paul was 61 years old and Harriet was 53. She was also now Miss Harriet Bullock Case. According to a friend of Paul's, this legal event was followed by a ceremony in Harlem, New York. Harriet was deeply opposed to segregation and racism in any form. As such, she was very keen on the fact that the minister performing the wedding was of African descent. Anne, from back in Los Angeles, wrote to the newlywed couple saying, "I had a little note from Kitty today. She said that you were both radiantly happy, and that you, Poppy, looked as young as you did 20 years ago. Hearing this made me so happy." She followed up with another letter saying, So now you are thoroughly married, not just legally. I know how beautiful the liberal Catholic ceremony is. Paul and Harriet stayed out east in New York and New Hampshire for 6 months in 1946, and then for another 6 months in 1947. When in New York, they lived in one of Harriet's Manhattan homes. In New York, Paul gave a series of 3 lectures at the Pythian Temple, followed by a more involved set of classes at their home, comprised of 8 lessons on the principles of mental mastery, given over the span of 4 weeks. This same program was repeated in Los Angeles in 1947. Ann Davies and Jason Lotterhand were present to warmly receive Paul and Harriet when they finally arrived in Los Angeles. Paul and Harriet bought a new home for themselves at 5336 Highland View Place, which they lovingly named Tifereth. This left the Springvale Drive headquarters house for Ann and Bonnie. It also opened up more space for office work and classes. Harriet began contributing right away, and the office was soon outfitted with new equipment for reproducing and mailing lessons. In addition to these improvements, some of Paul's long out-of-print public writings were republished in 1947. One of these new printings was the second edition of the Book of Tokens. Another was a much expanded version of A Brief Analysis of the Tarot, now titled The Tarot, A Key to the Wisdom of the Ages. An inscribed copy can be found in the Los Angeles Temple archives. The inscription reads, "To Harriet, who made possible the work of preparing this book, with love from her husband, Paul." So, after several years of hardship, the work began to gather steam and move forward from strength to strength, in large thanks to the efforts and contributions of Anne and Harriet. At the very least, with Harriet's arrival, there was no longer any concern about having enough food to eat. On October 18, 1947, Harriet became a grandmother when her son and daughter-in-law had their first child, David Crawford Burton, Jr. In those days, Paul Foster Case knew an enormous number of figures in the metaphysical and spiritual community, and Los Angeles had a highly concentrated population of such individuals. Over time, both Anne and Harriet became part of that informal network. A letter from Harriet to Israel Regardie gives us a glimpse. Dear Francis, I just want to tell you again how very much Paul and I enjoyed our evening with you. It was delightful and interesting from beginning to end. We hated to leave, and I fear at that we kept you up too late considering your busy and taxing days. Thank you for everything. We shall get in touch with you soon and shall look forward to meeting your fiancé. Sincerely, Harriet. Due to her fluency in French, Harriet took over most of the responsibilities for correspondence with French students. In one of the exceptions, Paul wrote to a member in France on May 30th, 1953. And Harriet, poor darling, has been sadly beset for more than a month. For nearly 3 weeks prior to May 2nd, she and I both suffered from a miserable virus influenza which has been going the rounds here all winter and early spring. That lowered her vitality considerably, and then, the evening of May 2nd, as she was carrying a plate of doughnuts from our pantry into the dining room, she tripped, fell, and broke off the top of the ball from her left hip joint. The subsequent surgery, hospital stay, and recovery were quite involved, but Harriet was made of tough and rugged stock. The following year, in March 1954, Harriet and Paul drove down to Mexico City in their Pontiac for some much-needed vacation time. Paul was 69 years old, and had several health issues, probably because of his numerous years of severe austerity. Perhaps as a result, this journey proved to be the last of his many travels. In his final letter, dated February 22, 1954, Paul wrote to Ann Davies and described the charms and splendors of the city that they were enjoying: extraordinary meals, engaging conversations with local occultists, delightful outdoor musical performances, and much more. In his closing words, Paul wrote, "Next time we come down here, I want you with us. You'll have what I'm having, the time of a lifetime." On the night of March 2nd, Harriet called Anne to inform her that Paul had suffered a stroke and was at a local hospital. Then, a couple of hours later, a second stroke occurred, and he passed peacefully. Although Harriet reported strokes, the official cause of death was listed as auricular fibrillation of the heart. The time of death was recorded as 11 p.m. On a rather surprising coincidental side note, the certifying doctor was named Carlos Castaneda. In accordance with Mexican law, Paul was cremated shortly thereafter. B.O.T.A issued an official announcement which included the following statement: "In accordance with his expressed wishes, a memorial service will be conducted on Tuesday, March 16, 1954, at 11:30 a.m. in the Church of the Recessional at Forest Lawn Memorial Park." The service itself was conducted by one of Paul's friends, a fellow liberal Catholic priest named Father Henry Doneth. He was assisted by Eugene Imard. Later, in the official LCC publication B.O.T.A, the following account of Paul's service appeared. Over 200 of his friends and pupils gathered at the beautiful church of the Recessional for the memorial requiem. It was perhaps the most impressive liberal Catholic Eucharist that has been celebrated in this area for many a long year. Several persons present testified to the inner beauty of the service and to the presence of Dr. Case, at whose especial request this memorial service for the repose of his soul was arranged. One of Dr. Case's pupils, who is totally blind, was able, through inner sight, to see the candles on the altar. Mrs. Harriet Case, widow of Dr. Case, had brought the cremated ashes to the United States from Mexico City, and the box containing them was placed in the sanctuary. Numerous members of the congregation said afterwards, "That is exactly the sort of memorial service I want when I go. It was simply perfect." Prior to his passing, Paul appointed Anne to succeed him as Prolocutor General. Unfortunately, not everyone in the order was as confident in her as he was. There were other members who were generally considered to be more experienced and knowledgeable. But thankfully, Harriet was unswerving in her wholehearted endorsement of Anne. Without Harriet's steadfast support, it is all too possible that our history may have taken a very different turn, and we would not be gathered here today. Anne had several practical and esoteric adaptations to the order that she greatly wanted to make manifest, as directed from within by the inner school. One of the first of these was the legal transition from an educational foundation to a religious and educational foundation. The first two B.O.T.A ministers were Ann Davies and Ruth Athay, another board member, who joined the order around 1938. The ordinations took place on August 30th, 1956. Harriet was ordained the following year on March 16th, 1957, on the third anniversary of Paul's memorial. Another major goal of Anne's was the establishment of a permanent temple space. This was finally achieved in 1959 with the purchase of the property on Figueroa Street. Felix Frazier did a lot of the legwork, and, apparently, Harriet made the initial down payment. A dedication ceremony was conducted at the temple on Sunday, October 11, 1959. Almost immediately after, several new activities were launched, including esoteric Kabbalistic services every Sunday, classes on Tarot and Kabbalah on Thursdays, and a new ritualistic form of group work called Pranayas. Thankfully, this event was recorded. The audio is not very clear, but it gives us a rare opportunity to hear Harriet speak.
I would like now to introduce to you Mrs. Paul Foster Case, Grand Cancellaria of Builders of the Adytum, and in English that means Executive Secretary.
Sounds very fancy, but all I can say is I'm very happy to see Paul here. Because as Anne says, this is really quite an occasion for us. And it is the realization of Dr. Case's dream. And of course, as she said, it could not have come into being had it not been for the Lord's light, the inner school, the plans. But also, it couldn't have come into being had it not been for the help of our wonderful staff and our volunteer workers and our members who have been so loyal and so dedicated and helped with this work in every way. We have struggled for a long time, and now we feel we've come to a wonderful realization. Thank you.
Although much of this talk has highlighted her financial contributions, this is truly only a very small fraction of Harriet's story of service. She gave so much more. When Anne became our Prolocutor General, Harriet filled Anne's previous shoes, and those were not easy shoes to fill. She was a stalwart worker, printing, folding, stapling, addressing, and mailing envelopes. Harriet was also the primary correspondent for the order, writing to and responding to hundreds, if not thousands, of students all around the world. The letters that survive beam with genuine compassion, astounding clarity, profound spiritual guidance, and a real sense of connection with the needs and aspirations of each and every person. She did all of this humbly, without any apparent desire for attention, recognition, or recompense. Aside from the letters, official board minutes, and similar documents, her name rarely appears, which seems to be exactly as she wanted it to be. When Adytum News Notes went into publication, Harriet was one of the regular contributors, penning several articles between 1959 and 1967. In her writings, we can see the tremendous depth of her consciousness. Like Paul and Anne, she could have been a teacher. But Harriet saw the light that shone in and through them, and chose to use what gifts life had bestowed upon her to empower them in their service to humanity. She served the servers, quietly behind the scenes, valuing the work above any expectation for recognition or personal reward. This was her way. Harriet lived a long life and saw many of those who were most important to her pass on before her, including Louis and Paul. On April 27, 1963, her daughter Sheila died suddenly from a heart attack at the age of 43. Then, on March 21, 1969, her mother transitioned too. On March 24, 1972, at 5 p.m., Harriet completed this life of service, having been witness to some of the most extreme peaks and valleys of human experience: brutal and mindless cruelty, greed and selfishness, but also indescribable expressions of love, genuine altruism, astonishing beauty, and transcendent realization of the Eternal One, ever present, alive, and at work in all things, always. Through it all, she kept her heart bright and was a shining instrument for the primal will to good. Harriet's ashes were laid next to Paul's at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. 3 years later, in 1975, Ann Davies would join the two in a region of the grounds named Haven of Peace. But to those of us who follow their guiding light, this little patch of revered ground is known as Adept's Row. May light be extended upon you. Shalom.